as a kid, I was always pretty cheeky. I loved to annoy adults. If I could do anything to annoy adults, I would take the opportunity, even if I knew a punishment was involved, especially my family. I loved embarrassing my family, always making jokes about my dad and his grey hair and just any opportunity. And I still have a bit of that in me now. I'm almost 40 years old. I've kind of calmed down a little bit. But I do like to trigger people sometimes, and especially DDD people. I think Ian Cooper made some great points here. The Domain-Driven Design book is from its time. You know, you think about the book was published 2004. Eric's writing that book in the late 90s. It's going back a fair few years. So I think it's good, and I think it's healthy to challenge some of those ideas. And that's kind of what this talk's about in a way. Before we get into the talk, I've got a book to give away. So maybe, Chris, you can not say anything for the next few minutes. I know you're a genius and it's hard to keep all those amazing ideas you've got inside, but just for this next couple of minutes, please. So maybe who can tell me something you did as a kid that was very cheeky or mischievous that you got in trouble for?
First time I learned how UNC paths work was on the high school computer network. Shared folders.
You hacked into your teacher's shared folders. That is pretty mischievous. Wonder what you found in there. Probably, maybe you can't tell us that bit. Oh. Ah, cool. Well, you can definitely have this copy of the book. Okay, let's trigger some DDD people. So not everyone comes to DDD meetups and appreciates all the subtleties of domain-driven design. This person here doesn't seem to like anything about domain-driven design. You might as well use tarot cards for designing your boundaries.
I missed that one. Yeah.
So you guys have been talking about all this domain storytelling stuff. Is it 2 or is it 1? I've been sitting over there with tarot cards and I have the answer all this time. This person is reading the book, but doesn't appreciate all the technical jargon. It's about creating a good language by creating an even worse language, apparently. This one here, making fun of the concept of bounded context, stuffy, arcane, realms, linguospheres. These guys really aren't holding back in their criticism. Herman Piran makes some good points. We have this concept of ubiquitous language that only applies within the confines of a very specific boundary. Doesn't quite meet the definition of ubiquitous. And then we've got Jeremy Miller, who's just not happy about any of the code he's seen that has a DDD approach behind it. So you might wonder, where am I taking all of this? Well, there are these criticisms, but even Eric Evans recognizes that if he could go back in time and change some parts of DDD, he would. He would move this chapter 14 about strategic DDD earlier in the book, maybe chapter 2 or 3. So I thought, what could we do? How could we make all these people happy if we could go back in time and do DDD differently and have an alternative timeline? What would we do? So Eric wanted to move one chapter a bit earlier in the book. I thought, what if we throw away the whole book and just keep one chapter? How radical would that be? Would that make things better? And actually, this idea comes up because I do actually read the book every couple of years. And I always come across this chapter, chapter 8, called Breakthrough. And I always think to myself, there's a lot of stuff in this chapter that doesn't really get talked about. I feel if people read this chapter first, they might come away with a very different opinion. So I want to talk about that today. My friend Max, he calls it the forgotten chapter because of what I was talking about. So I'm going to talk you through this chapter. I've got some real quotes in there, and then I'll add my observations and opinions. And in particular, how these ideas and insights from this chapter are still quite relevant today, even if a lot of the stuff in the book might not be, as Ian touched on. So this chapter starts with a bit of context. Eric and his friends, they've been in New York where they live doing this long winter of refactoring. Quite a nice start to the story, I think. New York was one of those cities that disappointed me, by the way. This was one of them. So after a long New York winter of refactoring, we had arrived at a model that captured some of the key knowledge of the domain and a design that did some real work for the application. We were developing a core part of a large application for managing syndicated loans in an investment bank. So that's kind of what they've been refactoring over this winter. And here, Eric explains the significance of this project and why it's important and why the insights in this chapter can be relevant on significant projects. So when Intel wants to build a billion-dollar factory, they need a loan that's too big for any single lending company, or was 30 years ago. I don't know if that applies nowadays. So the lenders form a syndicate that pools its resources to support a facility. There's some domain jargon here. You don't need to worry about this. The key points are understandable. What's that?
The key part is ubiquitous language.
Whatever that means, which isn't very ubiquitous. So here he outlines exactly what his team's working on. An investment bank usually acts as a syndicate leader, coordinating transactions and other services. Our project was to build software to track and support this whole process. So we then get to this point and they explain to us why it had been an interesting winter, why there's a lot of refactoring. So 4 months before, we'd been in deep trouble with a completely unworkable inherited code base. Every inherited code base developed by other people is completely unworkable. We might think Eric Evans is some ultimate superstar genius, but he's just like the rest of us. He thinks your code sucks and his is the best. So we had since wrestled into a coherent model-driven design. They've taken your awful legacy and they've turned this into a lovely model-driven design. That was their winter. But they've got some disconcerting signs. Not everything's happy here. They kept stumbling over unexpected requirements that complicated the design. A major example was the creeping understanding that the shares in a facility were only a guideline. So starting to get a sense of here that something's not quite right, even though they feel quite happy. I also think unexpected requirements is always an interesting one. Were they unexpected, or did you just focus on the happy path and not do enough exploration up front? But since he's the DDD expert, I'm sure he did plenty of upfront discovery, and these really were unexpected requirements that nobody could ever have anticipated. But what's interesting about this is the insight here. They'd done this refactoring, they'd arrived at a better solution, but they got this feeling that the complexity of the code base was getting out of control. This code feels too complex for the business problem we're solving, but at this point, just kind of a hunch or a feeling. So then they had accommodated this. So there's some kind of workaround here. We accommodated this awkwardness by adding loan adjustments to the model. They added this new concept to their model. Refinements of this kind allowed us to keep up as the rules of the various transactions became clearer, but complexity was increasing and we did not seem to be converging quickly onto really solid functionality. So they've made some change. They've added this concept to their domain model. It's allowing them to keep working, but they're not quite happy. And I think this is an important lesson, one of the first lessons from the chapter. As a developer, one thing is implementing new features. Got some requirements, implemented the new feature. Are we happy here? Some developers will be very happy in this situation. In this case, Eric and his colleagues, they got this feeling of, this is a bit too complex. We don't know why, but maybe this code could be implemented in a simple way on a domain level. Something's not quite right here. It's more of an intuition at this point. And that's my first question to you, basically. Is this something that you recognize in your work? Do you ever stop and think, I've managed to implement this new feature, but I'm not quite happy with the domain model. I feel like I could implement it in a simpler way, but I don't know. You got a story to share?
No, but I have experienced this here, particularly in finance, where you think I have no idea what I'm doing. The quant is told, give me some information, whatever, eventually, and I am just essentially painting by numbers. And the design looks very complicated because you realize you don't actually know the domain well enough to really make it simple.
Exactly. That's the next part of the story. You've just kind of given a bit away there, but that's the point here. Yeah, it's like I asked you to give it away, so it's all good. I wasn't expecting such a great answer. So yeah, that's the point. It's like I don't really understand these concepts I'm implementing. Am I doing it in a completely incoherent way?
Is he a genius?
Is who a genius? Ian Cooper. When I got my first job 15 years ago, his was one of the blogs I was reading the most. When I moved to London, I went to his .NET meetup. So yeah, he's a genius to me. He's not a genius. He's a genius. The real geniuses don't go around saying they're geniuses.
What Nick's really saying is I'm old. Because I was already old, is what he's saying.
Is the plural of genius genii?
We need to ask a genius. So I don't mean to be too cheeky. That's what I talked about as a kid. I get these impulses like I could be a bit cheeky here. I can't control myself sometimes.
The point is that the business will never tell you what they want up front. You have to discover. That's the whole point. So architecture's got to be relevant, be handled, adapt to your requirements.
Yeah, definitely. Talk a lot about this in my work, in workshops. Always challenge your requirements, explore possible future use cases.
It happened that we got this requirement, and the business said, I'm going to explore that. So it's not a negative.
Absolutely. And then it's about working out how serious are they about this requirement. Is it an off-the-cuff wish list, or could it be on the roadmap in the next 6 months? That's one of the real skills of an architect, I think. Figuring out when the business talk about new features and ideas, how serious are they? You can end up building a very complex system, expecting requirements that never come. Or you can go the opposite direction and not be prepared for things that were always obviously going to happen at some point. Anyways, so Eric, back to the story. So they began to suspect that their model had this basic design problem, as Ian was talking about. A lack of design knowledge was giving them some intuitions here, but they weren't sure why. So that's the first part of the chapter, I would say, this kind of intuition feeling like your code is too complex, but you're not sure why, something on a domain level. So the second part is what I think about as the value of domain-driven software design, where DDD becomes beneficial. So this moment came in the story. 1 week it dawned on us what was wrong. Our model tied together a facility and loan shares in a way that was not appropriate to the business. They coupled these two concepts in an ineffective way, and that was causing some awkwardness, making it more difficult to implement features than it should have been. So they get around a whiteboard, they've got the business experts nodding, they've hashed out this new model together, and they've gone through various scenarios or use cases, as Ian talks about, and they've got this new model. And that's another little segue here into how you can apply this mindset in your work. So Eric created this concept called the model exploration whirlpool. It's a way of dealing with these situations. So if you are wondering at any point, I don't feel, or maybe it's upfront and you're thinking, how do we get requirements? How do we understand things better? Or maybe you're in a situation where you've got this awkward software and you're like, how do I get myself out of this? Where do I go from here? This whirlpool can provide you with a model to work from. I'm not going to go through the whole part of this, but there is one part of this whirlpool, one piece of advice that I do think is timeless, that he does touch on in the book. And that's a piece of advice I give out a lot and I use myself a lot, which is the concrete scenarios. Similar to the use cases Ian talked about. If you're ever in a difficult situation, one of the easiest, the most effective things you can do, in my opinion, is just to say to some domain expert, can you talk me through a concrete use case or a concrete story? Tell me about a specific person trying to achieve a specific goal, purchasing a specific kind of product. Talk through that story step by step in granular detail. Then you can talk about other related stories. You get this real concrete domain knowledge. If you try and stay too abstract, that's when things can feel distant. By going through these concrete stories, that's when you can grasp those concepts in a bit more detail. So I think this has definitely passed the test of time. I definitely use and talk about this on quite commonly. Something that's a bit more modern is how you can actually apply this in your regular work. So if you can't do event storming and you can't do domain storytelling all the time, either it's not feasible, you don't have the time, people aren't willing to support it, there are other ways that you can apply this into your regular work. So there's a concept here called example mapping. And the idea is you take some action that some kind of person or role is trying to achieve, and you identify what are the different scenarios and what are the possible outcomes that could come in these different scenarios. This is like a way to get into DDD in a light way, in a low complexity. You can do this on a regular basis in short sessions. It's a good entry point. I was working with an Austrian company a few years ago, very complex domain, code base in German. I don't speak German, having a lot of difficulties. Leadership were complaining, this team's never deploying stuff at the end of the sprints. What was happening was developers were getting vague requirements, tried to implement it, needed clarifications, didn't understand the domain. So we introduced example mapping, and basically every sprint, we would do example mapping on the next sprint's work. Out of these sessions, the team would uncover these different scenarios, and then we could go back to the stakeholders and say, we've fleshed out the requirements in a bit more detail. And sometimes they would say, oh, that's not working as we expected. That use case we don't care about, don't worry about it. And on one occasion, they were like, oh, this whole thing's way more complex than we realized. Let's just not build the whole thing. Like, came back a few months later in a different form, and it didn't quite work out, but that's not the point of the story. But if you're wondering, how can I start to apply these concepts, these concrete use cases, you can use something like this, bake it into your sprints, an hour every 2 weeks. It's definitely achievable. So back to the story, we've got an example of this with Eric. He's at the whiteboard with the domain experts. He's not trying to create this super generic domain model that a genius would create. He's just being a down-to-earth normal person going through some concrete stories. So the diagram says that the borrower has chosen to draw an initial 50 million loan from the 100 million committed under the facility. The three lenders chip in their shares in exact proportion to the facility shares, resulting in a 50 million loan divided among the lenders. So we've got specific numbers, got a number of lenders, and we're being quite concrete here. Potentially, we could be even more concrete here, but this is a good example of not trying to be too abstract, solve every use case at the same time. So from this experience with the domain experts at the whiteboard, going through some concrete scenarios, they had two deep insights. The first was the realization that investments and loan investments were two special cases of a general and fundamental concept, which is shares. Shares of a facility, shares of a loan, and shares of a payment distribution. Don't need to worry too much about all the jargon, but basically they've uncovered this new domain concept called a share. And that's having some, this is that hunch they were having. Looking at the domain in this way, everything starts to make sense now. They could go through all of these use cases they were struggling with before, and it fits neatly into their model. They're able to solve this problem in a much simpler way. And all of these unexpected requirements would fit much more easily.
And the business call is share in each case.
Well, that's interesting. Where did the word share come from? That would be, were they using that word all the time and developers missed it? Or were the developers not probing enough? Maybe the business experts didn't realize that they had to talk about that concept. We'd have to ask Eric about that one.
Sometimes I've found it in the past that it's not until you realize the importance of a word as a solution to the problem that you hear people saying it. They've been saying it all along, you just never heard it. And then now you basically say, let's call it. Yeah, sometimes you actually say, oh, but from the way you get to that, you just go, why does so-and-so keep talking about shares, right? And you suddenly realize someone's been talking about this thing. You've never picked up on it because you didn't have the mental model to grasp that was an important term they were using.
Is it a metaphor?
Well, you had to come up with the concept for them. That's the thing they didn't really understand.
Is it a metaphor? I don't know if in this case. I would have to talk to Eric about that. Apparently metaphors were a big thing 20 years ago. I'm not sure if they're that big anymore. So their hunch was correct, basically, on the basis of this new way of looking at the domain. Oh, we talked about that one. What we've reached here is a modeling breakthrough, and it's really a knowledge breakthrough. You realize that something about your model is not ideal. It's causing awkwardness and complexity. And by having this new insight about the domain, by getting some new domain knowledge, improving your understanding of the domain, you can actually make your software much simpler. We're not talking about design patterns here or solid or Yagni or any of those things. It's actually by learning the domain better, you can simplify your software. Yeah, I think that's basically the key concept here. So they've reached this great point in the story. Everyone's happy. The new model works really well, but they all feel sick. What's going on here? So they had a severe deadline. They've identified this new conceptual model and how they can improve it, but the project's already behind schedule. Even Eric Evans works on projects that are behind schedule. I was actually at a conference a few years ago. Eric Evans and Kent Beck were there, and they were talking about this project that failed. And I'm like, so what happened then? This project failed and you both started writing books? And they were like, yeah. True story. So that brings us to part 3 of this chapter. We've seen the value of domain-driven software design. We can solve problems in a much simpler way. But modeling is an investment, and they've got this project that's behind. Are they going to do this, or all this nice domain models down the whiteboard forever and in their heads? So we get an interesting point in the story here. The gospel of refactoring is that you always go in small steps. You always keep everything working. This is the textbook advice you get, right? Don't do all this big crazy refactorings. Always move in small steps. But Eric Evans doesn't follow those rules. He has his own way of living. To refactor our code to this new model would require changing a lot of supporting code. And there would be few, if any, stable stopping points in between. Whether that's the truth or whether that's his justification for breaking the rules, that's one for you to think about yourself.
That's not refactoring. That's redesign.
You'd have to take it up with Eric Evans.
I think he said it himself. He was one of the founders. I worked on a big project like this, and basically Ordnet screwed up massively, and they just wrote it all off and didn't tell me what. So it's a tax dodge.
Wow, you think that's what's really happening here?
If they fucked it up and they didn't care, it would just go. Right.
Wow, that's a whole new spin on this chapter. I would definitely keep this chapter. I would expand the whole book to be built around this story and get to the tax dodging bit. From domain storytelling to tax dodging, this has been a real journey this evening, and we haven't finished yet. Have you been watching Office Space? So back to the story. They've got this big project that's behind deadline and this nice new model. What's going to happen? So Eric spoke to his project manager, and the project manager gave them the go-ahead and even said, if it goes wrong, I'll handle the heat. You developers do your refactoring, and I'll take all the blame for it if the project's late. Sounds almost hard to believe. Of course, Eric had lots of admiration for this project manager taking that decision. But I think, again, this brings us to another interesting question. If your project is behind and there's already a lot of pressure to deliver, would you actually even suggest, let's redesign the code? What are people who don't write software going to think? You want to delay this project so you can change your code in a way that doesn't change how it works. What's all this about? It just sounds like developers and their perfectionism. I had a CEO a couple of years ago. I spoke to the developers and they were like, we've got so much legacy, business are asking for new features. I spoke to the CEO and he's like, my developers all have OCD. They're always talking about rewriting stuff. That's how this could have been interpreted. And I think the other important part of this question is, could you as a developer or an architect, could you even have that conversation? Do you have enough trust with the product and project people you work with that they would think, I trust this tech person. If they say this is the right thing to do and they believe that this is the right thing for the whole project, I'm going to trust them and take the heat for them. So again, to have good software, we need to have good relationships when these big decisions need to happen. So now we get to the pies and some other interesting parts of the story. So SharePie became this unifying theme of the whole application. It went from this model breakthrough to something that became much bigger. The technical people and the business experts, they used it to talk about the system. It became this ubiquitous language. And even the marketing people used it to explain features to the customers. So, this concept of a share has grown into a pie, and now everyone's talking about this amazing share pie. And I think this brings us to another really interesting aspect of domain-driven design. Probably even more relevant now than it was then, but it's a two-way system. The domain you're working in hasn't necessarily been fully fleshed out, and the domain experts don't have all the answers and all the words. You can invent new concepts, you can invent new ideas, and in a way, you can drive the domain yourself. You can find better ways to express those concepts. And yeah, I think as a developer, just having that perspective on a daily basis, can I change the domain I'm working in? Can I help the domain experts to create this language and improve how we talk about this? Because they might not have all the answers themselves. And if you look at a lot of the literature at the moment, a lot of the work that's been happening in the world of product management, people like Marty Kagan, Melissa Perry, they're actually talking a lot about this, bridging the gap between business and IT, having developers and testers and architects all involved in product discovery. This world between implementing software and the actual domain itself, it's all getting much closer. So that's another interesting question. Thinking about the teams you've worked in, how often have you actually done this? How often have you actually, as development teams, introduced ideas into your backlog or introduced new domain terminology? If you're doing a lot of this, it's all good. If you're not, maybe this is something that you could be thinking about trying on a more regular basis. So we get back to the story. They've released a new version of the software that involves this wonderful SharePie, and they reach another awkward aspect of the design that was making things more complicated. And that's another key story here. As you go on this journey of getting new domain knowledge, as you learn about one area of the domain and you improve your model in one aspect, that leads you to the next area. You realize, oh, now I've learned about this, I realize my knowledge of this isn't that well. And it's a process that builds momentum and keeps improving. And here's the real mic drop moment from the story that proves or demonstrates why all of this effort's worth it. People sometimes say, is it really worth it to spend 1 hour arguing over a word? Sometimes it is. And if you do this well, over the course of a project, adding new features can actually get faster. We often think that as code gets older, it gets harder to work with. But if you're continuously learning about the domain and applying that knowledge to your code, the code is more supple and aligned to the domain. You have more domain knowledge. So yeah, of course, it should be actually easier to implement new features. And so I think that's the real opportunity here. We can end up with this Formula One car in the early days. Adding new features is easy, and it can get worse and worse over time. Or we can have a spaceship where we actually get even faster if we invest in learning the domain and keeping that model up to date. A lot of this will vary on different parts of your system. We've got core supporting and generic subdomains. We might not be able to do this everywhere in such detail, but it's always worth thinking about where could we do this? Where do we need to go quickly as a company? I'm going to quickly wrap things up now. If you're into DDD and looking for some more tools and techniques, DDD Crew is a good place to get started. That's quite practical based. which is a nice complement to the book, which is a bit more theoretical. I've got 4 quick takeaways I think are worth, like if someone hadn't read DDD book and didn't know about DDD, I'd say these are 4 takeaways, but you might have other takeaways, that's totally fine. So firstly, if you're working with some code and changing it is difficult, or it feels more difficult than it should be, it might not be that your code doesn't follow all of these software design principles. It might be that your knowledge of the domain is lacking some key insights. Secondly, while you are implementing a domain model in your software, you can also change the domain. If something feels awkward, if something feels missing, add it to your domain model, introduce new concepts. Don't be afraid to try and propose these ideas with your domain experts. Design's an investment. It can pay off in the long term, but as we saw in this story, you're going to need buy-in from people around the software. If people are thinking you're just a bunch of geeks with OCD, what's that? I didn't look at you. You must be just defensive about something I said. And the 4th point, rather subjective, but you don't need to worship the Church of DDD to achieve any of these things. You don't have to follow all the rules by the book. Remember, Eric didn't follow all the rules by the book. He didn't refactor in an effective way. In fact, he didn't even refactor. He used the word refactor incorrectly. Is that right? So yeah, you don't have to follow all the rules. You don't have to use all the words. A lot of these principles are useful, whatever you call them. So 3 quick questions to think about yourself. What would be your alternative DDD timeline? If you could rewrite history, chop things up, change events, what would you do? Which of this talk represents the kind of challenges you're working on the most? Which one of these things might be something you could think about, try differently? Yeah, and why does it stand out to you? Is it maybe you've never tried it before, or you tried it, something like this, it didn't work? Maybe now's a chance to try that again. Just some ideas to try and make this a bit more actionable for you. But unfortunately, you're now back in the real DDD timeline, not my version. So that's the end of it. Thank you.
If you've got the DDD tools, you have the time to investigate the domain. So that's the trouble. People start with MVC or these framework, complex frameworks. If you don't have a framework that supports DDD, you don't have time to really do it properly.
So you need a framework to do DDD.
But when you're implementing it, you need a tool set that gives you all that enables you to be agile.
I feel like that one would be quite controversial. I mean, I said some things here, but what you just said is really controversial about frameworks and DDD. That is, I would never go there. No.
Tools and everything we want to know. I've been using that one DDD tool for more than 10 years. It's rock solid, and I keep adding new features to it. It's amazing tool set. So I know that I've got time to work on business.
I think from a developer experience perspective, if you have certain conventions and you want to apply those conventions consistently, and you've got a framework or a library that bakes them in, then yeah, I would agree. The challenge is always, does the framework push you in a direction that you might not otherwise want to go in? Does it force you to put attributes in places where you might not want to put them and stuff? I know people have various opinions about attributes. Does your framework require XML config files? Does it?
It's called ASP.NET Boilerplate, but they've changed the name. It's called abb.io version, if you know that one.
I don't know the framework, but I would use a framework if we as a team agreed on some conventions and that framework contained those. Oh, that's just some techniques. It's not really a framework. It's not really anything at that level.
The risk if you use a framework is that developers start to focus on the technicalities of that framework instead of talking to the domain, talking to the actual business and understanding the domain. It becomes almost like, I'm not saying that's the case,
Or
Well,
It
seen the other
just
couple.
enables you to do the DDD because all the hard work's been done on the infrastructure side.
Yeah, so you actually focus on the domain because
Yeah,
you're
you're
saying
saving
that
time because it makes your own job.
I'm not a big fan of frameworks.
Isn't it about, modeling the software rather than
Well, yeah, but
focusing on technical solutions?
it is, but you still need an implementation. And that's where this.
Yeah, that's what you get here. So like you do the first part,
I have
and you
the
don't
tools.
think too much about how to model the aggregates,
I
how
have
to
actually
design them,
built-
or
yeah,
how to
that's all
technically
done
them,
for me.
how to persist them.
I just have to build the models.
let's park this one here. Maybe we can continue this one afterwards about frameworks. I wasn't prepared to be blindsided by framework question. Haven't had that one for a while, but there's different sides to that. Would I use a framework if it used conventions that work for me and my team? Right. Oh, there's a question on the live stream. Where do I look on here?
And the Google Meets.
I didn't even know there was a live stream.
It's like, now people thinking, oh, maybe I should have said.
I'm just amazed that Eric spends 4 months refactoring. And after 4 months refactoring, he says to the project manager, yeah, we're going to be late because we just had another idea about refactoring. And the poor project manager effectively says, okay, I'll bet my career on it all, Eric. Eric comes up with SharePie, and everyone's like, SharePie is great. And the kicker of the story is at the end of it, Eric goes, I've got another refactoring. You don't go, I'm resigning. I'm resigning, Eric.
I think Eric is very likable. He's very persuasive.
We need to find this project manager and figure out what really happened back in the 90s.
I think that's
So the question is, where do you see vertical slice architecture fitting in here?
that was for Ian.
Oh, okay. You can answer it if you like.
I can come and answer to my website. Come on.
We can do a duet.
Oh, sorry, look at the time frame. Yeah, this was.
I think there's a lot of unnecessary pain caused by people talking about vertical slice, ports and adapters, that kind of thing, right? Certainly, there are some poor versions of port and adapters, like Onion, as a third opinion, that focus a lot on layering and DTOs and miss the actual simplicity of what Alistair was talking about, which is put the application code in the middle, have some adapters around the outside. That's pretty much it, right? And that's Eric's idea of have a model in the middle, push all the tech throughout the outside. Folks doing vertical slice are actually in many cases trying to achieve exactly the same thing. And essentially what they've got a little bit is Eric's notion of a kind of module, and nothing important that essentially can't do that, right? So I think there's a lot of warfare over nothing in many cases there. So
Is it that we are focusing too much in technical design rather than solving the modeling problem? I think,
Yeah.
in my view, we are quite limited in thinking from modeling software and addressing technical side of those things.
Yeah, the key idea, I think, is trying to remove the technical concern so that you can focus on the domain modeling problem. Second one, Nick was just talking about, that no one, Eric's not saying, and halfway through, I realized if I used, if I moved away from Maven towards Gradle, all of our problems would be solved, right? He says halfway through, oh, I realized this SharePie concept missing from our domain. And that is, I think, what a lot of us miss. We get over focused on this. React or Angular, it's probably not going to save you if your domain model is wrong.
I think it's the thing that's easy to talk about, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to talk about the technology. It's hard to talk about the domain in a generic way that you can share knowledge with other people.
And the domain involves you talking to actual customers and understanding their problems, right? Rather than just the rest of your engineering team.
Isn't there like a role for a liaison that comes between the stakeholders, the business side and the technical side where the developers are? Like a person that can understand the business, because we said there might be issues understanding the concepts in the domain itself. There might be somebody who can understand the domain at the same time he's a bit more technical than business people.
That's the product owner.
Yeah, so business analyst and product owner is supposed to be that kind of role, but there is a danger, I think, that it's Chinese whispers. That's probably not well for us to use it. Whatever Chinese whispers,
Yeah, telephone game.
Telephone game, okay.
So adding more people in the middle, is that what it is?
I think anytime two people talk, there's risk of miscommunication, so the more people in the chamber, the more miscommunication.
Yeah.
So isn't it kind of strange that, you know, we see business people and technical people, actually they're also business people. Trying to solve business problems, it's just we have different expertise.
Yeah, Rick, you're all part of the business, right? This whole phrase, the business. What are we?
That's quite artificial, you know, division over here. Right? So that's
Domain
my take
expert,
on it.
maybe that-
Yeah.
All right, maybe let's move on to this question. Lee's been waiting from 2007, which was a few minutes ago. So the question is, any tips on keeping a solution refactorable? Something that would have helped Eric to refactor in that example properly. How can I help Eric Evans refactor properly? I don't know, to be honest. I think there probably are things you can do. In my experience, I've always been a fan of test-driven development and pair programming or mod programming. And sometimes when you work on your own, there's a pressure to get things done quickly. But when there's two of you or more, you're more likely to stop and discuss things in a bit more detail and address them. So I feel like that can be one way, a more collaborative approach. But I feel like there have been situations in my career, like Eric talks about, where you've got a big change and getting there in small steps might not be realistic. Like I tried to rip a microservice out of a code base once, and I could have tried to do it in small steps out of a legacy system. But actually just cutting all the dependencies and seeing what worked and what didn't felt like a quicker way to learn. So I guess there's the learning aspect about what you want to do, how you want to, where you want to get to, and then maybe you could do the small step to get there. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that one. If they weren't able to do it there probably was a good reason for it. There probably are cases where it's not possible. But there probably are practices that you can do to avoid getting into those situations to reduce the number of times you end up in that situation.
Maybe back then they were doing waterfall and they had crazy deadlines and long cycles. But on a cycle, they have to deliver stuff in 2 years, right? So it's difficult to design the code appropriately so that you can refactor. At the moment, you're doing like 2 weekly sprints, and you have to design accordingly. That your methodology also dictates how you write your code and how you can refactor fast.
Yeah, so the practices at the time, I know Eric was a fan of XP, some of those ideas, some iterative, and he talked a lot about iterative modeling. So I assume there was some of that happening, whether with modern approaches that would have helped, or maybe this domain insight really was just the whole model just didn't fit in this new world, and there wasn't a simple way to get there. So we've got another question from, I believe it's pronounced Guru. If I pronounce that wrong, I'm sorry about that. But the question is, how would you approach if you're to introduce DDD into an existing application? So there's quite a bit that's been written about this topic, actually. On a conceptual level, you can have the domain discovery sessions, you can explore domain models with your domain experts. There's nothing that really stops you doing that at any point. But then you want to start applying domain modeling, well-defined domain models in a legacy system. And there's a couple of different approaches there. But the obvious pattern, or the simple pattern, is you build your new domain model and you have an adapter layer that talks to the old model. In effect, you're like, let's just hide that in the cupboard and we'll build this new one that keeps the cupboard door push closed, and all that's hidden away. And that can work sometimes. The complexity comes in that translation layer. How complex is it? I remember one point in my career, I was paired programming with a senior engineer. We had to implement this new piece of work. And he was a good senior engineer. His name was Gonzalo. He let me have a go at this problem. He's like, yeah, I'll let you solve this one, see how you would solve it. So I took this approach. I'm like, there's a lot of mess there. I don't want to touch that. I'm just going to implement this new requirement over here and then figure out how to translate it afterwards. Struggled with that for like an hour. And then he was like, yeah, maybe we could try something different here. Like he stepped forward. He knew it was his time to step forward. And what he did was, instead of building a new layer on top, he just like flattened and inlined all of the existing code. We tidied that up a bit. And I'm like, oh, wow. We had all of these classes and functions and everything, but when you just flatten the code, there's not actually that much there. So quick to just flatten the whole thing, tidy that up a bit, and then start applying the new feature on top of it. So I think there's different ways. One is to build on top, and the other one is fix what's there a bit first, and then build your new feature on top of it.
The code was over-architected. It was over-architected, so that's why it was able to fit.
Yeah, I think that I think it had evolved organically. Different people had worked in that team who maybe come in, built some new features, left the company or moved to another team. So there wasn't really any consistency there or any thought behind it. I think that bit of the system had been built when the company was a bit more of a startup, so they were moving quickly, things weren't that certain. So probably a mixture of moving quickly, different people, the people who may have worked on it, maybe not as skilled at software design, maybe they were more focused on getting stuff done quickly. So a number of reasons. Could have been over-architected, or it could have just been natural things just accumulating over time in a bit of an ad hoc fashion.
How would you go about doing modeling on a domain that's constantly changing? Like, do you have any tips on that? Like some of the times it feels like the domain extras that have it.
Yeah, so that's a very important question. So for the audience at home, basically the question is, if you've got a domain that's constantly changing, how would you go about modeling there? What would be your mindset in that kind of environment? I think the first question is to try and get on top of why is everything constantly changing? Is it because we're in the early phases of some new idea or concept and we're trying to find product market fit? In that case, it would be natural. And so in that mindset, I might be more of the opinion of, let's wait until things stabilize when we understand what's needed, and then we can do some proper modeling afterwards. We can accept being messy in the early days because we know a lot of what happens now might get thrown away anyway. It might not actually be that useful. The other scenario is you just got a bit of volatility or a bit whimsical, and there's just things are moving in different directions. People have random feature requests and we're not sure why. In that situation, I think I would try and address that problem in a bit more detail. Try and maybe before we implement software, before we start implementing those features, try and find a way to help those people to realize if their features are needed or not. How to do that can be difficult sometimes, but like I talked about earlier, you can do something like example mapping. Someone has an idea, and then you say, what might be some other scenarios here that could happen? And you realize there's this edge case and this edge case, and sometimes if this happens, then there could be this scenario, and that person might realize, oh, this is more complex than I realized, or not as useful as I realized. So trying to actually prevent those requirements coming in the first place, or helping people to refine those ideas, would be something I try to work on there. Anything else that comes to mind? Not right now, because my brain's a bit fried. But those are the two things. Is there a valid reason things are changing? Maybe we have to just deal with it, or is there some dysfunction that we need to try and address first?
This is basically in finance and in law, there's always rules changing. So you have a rules engine behind your team so that it can easily change.
Change as well.
But that's a good point there. Maybe you're working in a domain that does have lots of changes, and that's just a natural thing. Yeah, I think the rules engine is quite an interesting one. worked with an airline before, and they have like 10,000 rules. You've got like regional rules, national rules, individual airline rules, groups of airlines that have the same rules. So a situation like that where you do have a lot of different changes, that in that situation, you probably would actually design a more flexible solution that can handle those changes, I would say.
In a couple of slides, you said, I think kind of like model as an investment or something. And I've
Yeah.
also used that as well to kind of push for some longer term funding tool takes. Have you found that as an effective way to get through to get buy-in from the business side and so forth?
Not really. I think it's always difficult to explain a good software design. That's something I've tried a lot of times over the last 15 years, trying to explain why these practices matter, why investing in quality matters. But a lot of time it's like, we want to get this shipped in the next quarter, get it done.
So you just kind of just do it, and then it takes as long as it's within the acceptable tolerance.
I think there are different ways of approaching this here. I feel like in a lot of the teams I've worked in, or the teams I try and work in, that would be a decision the team makes themselves, and the team will just say, it takes this long, that's how long it takes, and that would include time to do proper modeling and maybe do some refactoring as well. So I think that's always a good place to get to, not always possible. Were there any other parts to your question I didn't answer there?
No, I was just like trying to use that kind of, oh, why, we could hack it together in 2 weeks, or we could put a bit more for do stuff faster.
One of the best examples I've seen is actually in my book, but I can tell you don't have to buy the book. It's actually a case study from someone else, so it's not my story. And basically, a company called mobile.de, Deutschland. So they, CTO and some of the architects, they were able to break through this technical barrier and explain this concept to the rest of the business. And they used a concept called cost of change. Basically, the idea is every time we implement a new feature, that makes the system more complex, and the next feature will have a higher cost to implement because this existing one added that complexity. So the next features will be more complex. That worked really well for them. And so whenever they talk about building new features, there's this shared agreement that this will make the system more complex. New features will be more difficult to implement. Therefore, they had like a budget. I think it's around 20% of the time to actually reduce that cost of change. So that worked for them. I think that's quite technical debt. Maybe doesn't always land that well, but I think cost of change is one that I would use as a default here. I think it makes sense. It's not too jargony. They've got some nice diagrams they use to help sell the idea of lines going up and down and everything, make it look professional. You've got to know the tricks as well as having good ideas. And there's a tool called CodeScene. I don't know if anyone's heard of CodeScene. It's a tool that can analyze your version control history, and it can kind of highlight the hotspots in your system. And it can tell you whenever a developer makes a change to that part over there, you're more likely to get a bug over here, for example. Or whenever you implement a certain kind of feature, you get changes in these two code bases. And so you can use the insights from that tool to try and explain to a less technical audience. It's called CodeScene. Adam Tornhill is a Swedish guy. And I had two Swedish guys in my workshop a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking about this tool, and they said to me, oh yeah, Adam Tornhill's a celebrity in Sweden. His tool CodeScene is so amazing and popular. The king of Sweden called him up and said, hey, I want to meet you. So that's a pretty interesting tool. I worked with a company in Canada, and the CTO used it. I think the leadership team were asking, can we fire all the contractors and save a bit of money? But he was able to use this tool, and it showed like there are some parts of the system that have only been worked on by contractors, because it looks at your version control, it sees which people have made the changes to each part of the system, and he was able to say, if we let go of all the contractors, we lose all the knowledge about these parts of the system. Might be a bit more difficult to explain that without a tool like CodeScene. So I haven't used CodeScene as much as I'd like to. I'm not saying, I'm not saying you should definitely use it, but again, it's something that you can look at think about using cost of change, tools like CodeScene. There are patterns out there that people have used effectively.
The book as well, Your Code is a Crime, saying that, or at the top.
Version 2 of the book's out now.
Okay, okay.
I think the tools is quite effective when you're working in certain legacy systems.
Yeah.
Where you can see hotspot and things. And what I felt is, all the time we have desire to change everything, and that's where we want to track. Right? So,
cool.
Another point is that Derek really likes to get the business experts together, assuming that most businesses can do that. Most of you can't. So, that's the thing, and then you only get them in dribs and drabs. And, you kind of go and hit them. Oh, is that really how it works? And then I'm going to go, oh, no, so what I told you yesterday was wrong. So you assume that you can get them.
Yeah. Couple of points I would add here. The first one comes down to company culture. If in your company people see developers as people who type things on keyboards, and anytime they're not at the keyboard, it's wasted. That's quite a fundamental issue you have to try and address some way. One of the ways you can address this is what some people call guerrilla modeling. You don't have to dress up as a guerrilla and do event storming. You just try to, for example, you might be in a conversation and a domain expert's talking. You might start modeling this with sticky notes, and then they can see your mental model. And that can be a way to introduce modeling, that you drive this, even if it's not something that people have necessarily agreed to, or you've not organized workshops, just trying to introduce it in places wherever you can do a bit of modeling, and hopefully it might grow from there. Do we have sorry, can we do this last question? Yeah. I've got a feeling it's going to be a great question, so I think we have to do this.
Sorry, it's not actually a question. I wanted to say that I hope that as many people as possible take away a fifth takeaway, which is do examples early, because I think a lot of the questions come down to, well, how can I react to changes in the domain or this or that? And a lot of times it's really not changes in the domain. It's just that you didn't explore hard enough. Actually force people to think in concrete terms.
Fifth takeaway from the talk, do examples early. Yeah. That's a great great note to finish on. Thank you.